Hello, and welcome to the Flourishing Gays Fireside Chat about trauma. I'm very happy to be with you today. My name is Dominic Longo, founder at Flourishing Gays. And I'm really so eager to have this conversation with two esteemed members of the Flourishing Gays team. Our purpose today is to create a resource for you, our viewers, to understand something more about trauma. What I've learned over the last couple of years working with LGBTQ men is how pervasive trauma is in this community, and how too often it's seldom sort of addressed or talked about. So in this conversation, our point is to sort of, alleviate that. And first I want to introduce DDS, Daniel Dobson Smith, who goes by DDS. You have training in neurolinguistic psychotherapy and executive coaching, and you're currently pursuing a master's degree in counseling psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And you've also worked in organizational development in a number of companies. DDS, glad to have you here.
Good to be here. Thanks for the intro.
You're welcome. And Sean Carpenter, you have more than a decade of experience in the field of mental health, organizational training, and human development, with particular expertise in adult learning, substance abuse, and trauma recovery. You have an MA in counseling psychology from the City University of Seattle, and a BA in psychology from the Central Washington University. And you now specialize in trauma-informed family systems coaching. Thank you for being here, Sean.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah. And just, I should say, I'm sitting here in New York City, and you can tell us where you are today.
Go for it, DDS.
So I'm in the East Bay area, so just east of San Francisco, in a city called Walnut Creek.
Yeah, and I joined the gentleman sort of in the middle of the country, here from Denver, Colorado.
Wonderful. So, I have some questions that we prepared, and, this is going to be an organic conversation, but let's just start off with a few basic concepts to sort of raise our trauma literacy. In a nutshell, what is trauma?
Yeah, I guess for me, really the basic description I can give about what trauma is it's really a response to deeply distressing or disturbing events that really overwhelm an individual's ability to cope. And it really causes some feelings of hopelessness, diminishes a person's sense of self and their ability to really feel the full range of emotions and experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the things that I like to remember about trauma is that trauma doesn't necessarily happen when you are in danger. It happens when you think you are in danger. So it's that kind of idea that we all can encounter stressful or overwhelming events or significant emotional experiences in our life. But when those significant emotional events kind of outweigh our ability to process or rationalize or understand, then we can be in the space of trauma.
Mm-hmm. So sort of being beyond our capacities to make sense of something is part of this.
For sure, yeah. We can expand on that even a little bit too, and really just say that trauma is different for everybody. We all could experience the same car crash, but it could look very different. It could be very non-effective for me. It could mean nothing. And for DDS, it could be incredibly traumatic, and lead him down a path of even a fear of getting in a car again.
Right. Yeah, it's the you know, I think my background in neurolinguistic psychotherapy, which isn't a thing in America, but is a thing in the UK. But it's all about how we construct our experience, and reminds us that as human beings, we're meaning-making machines, right? So we experience events, and in order to be able to experience the experience of the events, we have to create meaning in our heads. We have to kind of make it meaningful to ourselves. And if depending on where we are at in our development, depending on what kind of day we're having, depending on what's going on in our environment that is leading us to have access to resources or diminished access to resources, then events can happen, and the meaning that we make out of them can be different from moment to moment, or hour to hour, or day to day. And that in itself can bring with it like this idea of trauma happening. The fact that the resources, mental, emotional, or physical resources that we have available to us to make sense of a situation can be the difference that makes the difference between me walking away from the same car crash that Sean has spoken about, intact, mentally, emotionally intact, or mentally or emotionally diminished as a result.
Yeah. Well, this has already become quite fascinating. Let me just step back. You know, many of our viewers this might be quite new for them. I mean, there's a lot of kind of popular talk about trauma, and I mean, I'm not a psychologist. I think of, you know, the trauma ward in a like emergency room, or kind of physical trauma as like one of the basic understandings. And taking that into account, but everything in sort of pop culture, what would you say are some very common misunderstandings of trauma that you'd love to sort of disagree today?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dominic.
I'm like, you can take this one, Sean.
What are some misconceptions? I think misconceptions that people have is that it has to be this huge event that happens, right? So war is a great example, right? Missiles, bombs, 9/11. They have to be these like huge dramatic things, that big car crashes, right, where there's like 18 cars and flames, and really it doesn't have to be that something like that major, that significant.
A dog jumping across your screen, for example.
A dog jumping across your screen could potentially be traumatic. No, that's hopefully not traumatic for folks. I apologize to anybody who's watching this right now that it gets traumatized by dogs. However, that actually is a great example, Dominic, that you talk about. Speaking of dogs, right? An experience that you might have in adolescence or in your youth with a dog might cause some trauma for you. Thinking of, and it could be in a stage of your life where you're pre-verbal. And so we're really talking about like infancy and toddlerhood, where you might not have language for your feelings. So you could get bit by a dog at that age. A dog might bark at you and scare you. And that might turn you off, for all intents and purposes, to dogs, and potential joy that they bring, and their eccentricities and some of their annoying behaviors. But, that's an example. You could even think of the cats as well, right? And cats who scratch and bite you at a stage of your development where you might not have a way to like understand and react to that, and seek help for that in that moment.
Beautiful. Yeah. So one of those misconceptions is it has to be this big, truly life-threatening thing, and that's not the case. Any other like really big misconceptions? Okay, DDS, you have one, please.
Yeah, trauma only happens to the weak.
Ooh.
Right. That's and I think particularly when I think about male presenting, male identified people who, with the societal pressures around masculinity, and the identifying with something being traumatic, or even calling it trauma, can, you know, I guess can impact people in certain ways who don't want to be seen as weak. And the pressure to not be weak, and therefore the pressure to be able to shoulder all of the responsibility, to take it on the chin. But it's not true. You know, trauma happens to everyone, of all ages. It can happen across the lifespan. It happens to all genders. It happens to, and it happens around the world. And it's a very personal experience. And even though there are diagnoses around PTSD and you know, there's a big body of work around complex trauma, at the end of the day, it is a very, very personal experience, and no one gets to tell you what is or isn't trauma. No one gets to tell you what is or isn't triggering. No one gets to tell you what is or isn't traumatic for you. It's very personal.
Okay. Yeah, so actually I heard another maybe misperception or misunderstanding there, that trauma only happens to children. That might be another one that is just, you know, commonly held, but not the case.
Definitely. And I just want to add, because as DDS, as you were talking to, you know, not everything is trauma. Not everything is a traumatic event, right? You getting in a fight with your sister, you know, just because they called you for a bitch or something like that, right? Like, that's not really what we talk about in terms of trauma, right? Like, that's a fight between siblings. You know, we're talking about, you know, trauma is truly something, though it is individual. There's a lack of coping that comes with trauma, that you're not able to, you know, get over this, that it truly lives with you. And that's, I think, why I kind of started with the car example, because it's a really easy one to really latch onto. You know, for some people, right, getting in a car accident creates such a sense of fear of ever being in a car again, or any vehicle. And for some people, you know, it's their 16th car crash. And so, you know, it means nothing to them. They're just like, all right, they just broke another car, moving on.
So I'm actually noticing in the conversation, I'm learning that there's both an overuse of the term trauma and an underuse. So, you know, people like said, oh God, we couldn't get a reservation for dinner. It was so traumatic. I was just so hungry. So that happens, right? That's one usage. It's like, okay, that's not really a trauma. But then on the other hand,
actually, Dominic, let me just interrupt that a second, because let's say that individual who couldn't get a reservation at dinner and found it traumatic, when they were younger, experienced their parents arguing and fighting because one of their parents couldn't get a reservation, or something wasn't achieved, and they witnessed violence, whether that be verbal or physical, then that could be traumatic. Now, that individual might not be connecting the here and now event of not getting a reservation to the there and then event of their parents arguing over that, but it could be.
Yeah.
I think the idea for me around trauma is, what can point to trauma is if in the here and now as an adult, there are events or people or situations that you actively avoid and that get in the way of you functioning as an adult as the way you want to. Or if there are people or experiences or situations that you are drawn to, even though you know they're bad for you, that could point to trauma, right?
Yes.
But I agree with you. The word triggering and the word trauma, it has been brought into the mainstream, sometimes in unuseful ways.
Yeah. So what you just said kind of gets to another basic question that I'd love for us to talk about before kind of going to LGBTQ folks particularly. But first, on a general kind of lens here, what are some just adaptive strategies that affect us as adults? DDS, you just mentioned two: avoidance and kind of going towards something again and again as two strategies, if you will. Don't let me put words in your mouth. What are some adaptive strategies that we use as adults?
Who wants to go first here, DDS?
I mean, you know, there's a whole list of answers if you want to kind of get into the Freudian psychodynamic defense mechanisms of rationalization, of using humor, of intellectualization, of compartmentalization. Like, they're all adaptive strategies, right? But I'm thinking that you might not want to get into a heady conversation about psychology.
No, but I mean, I think listing some of those actually is helpful, because people don't necessarily know that. They know those words like compartmentalization, or even the idea of a defense mechanism. I mean, these are in the popular culture, but we don't necessarily know what they are. So I think it is good to just name at least some of them without, being comprehensive about, like, well, how do we deal with these traumas in our lives? How do we adapt? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, DDS is right on board with that. I mean, it ultimately really does look very different from individual to individual. What pops in my head a little bit, for some folks is just in terms of domestic violence. And so being a witness to that and as a younger person. And so your maybe adaptive strategy to that is to be a pleaser. And so, I'm always going to be catering and caring. And so if I'm this type of person, right, I'm not going to witness I'm not going to witness violence or see that. Again, going back to the car example, and DDS said this about avoiding, right, getting in that car accident and avoiding vehicles, avoiding transportation altogether. It really is an adaptive strategy, and it truly is very different from person to person what that looks like. Isolation and adolescence, right? Being neglected is probably a better way. So being left alone at home as a toddler, as a young kid, right? You might be like hypervigilant or more attention seeking. So you're always constantly like, hey, pay attention to me, right? So, those are just, I think, maybe a little bit more concrete examples of kind of what DDS was bringing forward, and where in your adolescence, youth, that might be presenting what you might look like as an adult.
Well, maybe the question I should ask is, I was using a term already, adaptive strategy. What is that? What is an adaptive strategy?
I mean, it's a way of showing up in the world that enables you to function as an acceptable adult in the environment, while minimizing or keeping at bay your trauma response. So that looks like things like using humor or minimization to kind of take the sting out of a situation. It looks like, for some people, the workaholic is an adaptive strategy. It's like, if I work as hard as I can and I make myself useful, then I'll be wanted and needed. That doesn't have to be, but it could be a trauma response.
What is
isolation from, say again?
You said trauma response. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. To me, a trauma response is similar to an adaptive strategy. It's this trauma happened to me. So in order for me not to make that trauma become who I am and dominate me, then I carve it off and I hide it away, and I either repress it, I don't know it's there and it's out of sight and out of mind, or suppress it so I know it's there, or I repress it so I don't know it's there, but it's still there, right? And when there are things that happen in my experience that are close enough in similarity, likeness, or proximity to the event, then I get triggered, right? Then my trauma gets triggered and I have a response. Now, if that response is to run away, or is to fight, or is to whatever it, or to freeze, or whatever it is, that response, that trauma response is not okay in the professional setting, or it's not okay at the bar, or it's not okay online, then I have this strategy that helps me to minimize the pain so that I can still show up as a relatively functioning adult.
Got it.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, super useful, super helpful. Thank you. So I feel like that's a good foundation just already in this conversation. So let's move to LGBTQ folks and gay men specifically. What are some of the ways that trauma shows up in sort of the gay community, especially of men, but in the LGBTQ community more widely, as you see it?
Same feeling, DDS. I'm like, it's a big question. What strikes me at first really is just in presentations in apps, your grinders, your scruffs, your growlers, your bumblebees, whatever floats your boat in terms of the apps. But what is interesting, and there's a little tie here of even just discrimination within our community. So when you're looking at the different boxes of like a mask only feminine, bottom top, what your race is, right? Like there's trauma within that, and so
how so, Sean?
Well, so just marginalizing different groups. So I think about Native American, Alaska Native groups, our Black friends and families, and saying like, well, I'm not into that. I don't, I'm not. Those aren't. I don't like to have sex with those people or whatever it is, right? And so, what you're creating, and you're creating you're adding to the story the narrative that they already have, just from a historical perspective of being slaves and being ripped from their families in Africa, or put in internment camps if you were Japanese during World War II, right? Like you're saying that you're othered, you're less than, and that truly can bring up some historical trauma for these individuals, and that narrative, that story of like, great, even in the community that I'm a part of, like the LGBTQIA plus community, I'm still othered, I'm still different, and so that that narrative still brings up depression, anxiety, right? Of even coming out, as I'm Asian. Oh, I don't like Asian people, right? Like there's something about they're even like it's like another trauma of here I am authentically me, and you're rejecting me. And so that could even connect again, like I was saying earlier, back to childhood feelings of are they an immigrant to our country, and coming to school in America and speaking English as a second language, right? Just thinking of how challenging that is, and the fear and the shame and all of that associated with that individual. And then you come along and you're like, well, I don't like this kind of person. Just it can bring that up for that person.
So marginalization by the marginalized is one way that if I can kind of synthesize what you shared into that. And again, just sort of zooming out, and DDS, maybe if you could take a shot at it. What are some other just like very prominent ways that trauma shows up in the LGBTQ world?
Well, let's talk about sex, right?
Baby, let's talk about it.
Talk about sex, baby. I read recently that most gay men's first sexual experience happens when they are underage, and usually happens with an older man, right? So according to the letter of the law, child abuse, is most gay men's first experience of sex. Now, my first experience of sex was with an older man, and it was really fucking awesome. Like, I really enjoyed it. It was exciting. It was the, you know, explorative. It was quick, but it was my first experience. And by society, that, and I'm not, and by the way, I am not sitting here saying that it's right, but I'm saying that my experience is, my first sexual experience is labeled as abuse, right? And it was, but at the time it didn't feel like that to me. And so I think about that, right? And I think about when sex that forms, you know, when a lot of people think about what makes somebody a gay man, they narrow it down to it being about who you have sex with. Now, of course, being a gay person is more than just about who you sleep with, right? But when your first sexual experience that is with an older man, that is either pleasurable or not, but is also shrouded in this idea of secrecy and abuse and not okayness, that then also gets played out, you know, on apps, in bars, in dark rooms. You know, you go to a bathhouse, you go to a dark room. I mean, it's been many years since I have, but then even there, the trauma happens with choice and rejection and prey and all of that sort of stuff. And so even when we don't think that it's happening, there's the archetypal experience that is potentially reigniting traumatic experiences that happened back then.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Both of you bring up some very thought-provoking examples.
I feel like I've completely outed myself, and
DDS, you're not the only one. You're not the only one.
There you go.
I appreciate the vulnerability and openness. Let's turn to the workplace and like corporate life in particular. And the experience of LGBTQ folks there, you know, how does trauma have some effect on LGBTQ folks' experience in their professional lives as you understand them?
Gosh, first of all, voice editing, tone policing yourself. You know, this is something I've experienced throughout my professional career, especially early on. Of, you know, you've got to be, if you're a man, you know, you've got to be masculine. You've got to have that deep voice, and you know, you can't just be authentically you. Even your mannerisms. I think DDS brought this earlier too, of just, you know, what you do with your hands, right? Like I'm sure we've all experienced it at some point in time. Like if you're limp-wristed, you know, you're gay, or you're too effeminate. So, you know, there's a firmness of standing up straight, right? And you know, this could, for some folks, it might not mean anything, right? But you know, my experience, you know, has been like, for myself, just like, you know, this is a bit of a trauma. This isn't really who I am, but I have to hide myself to keep myself safe. And that's the narrative that runs through my head, is that if I'm not masculine, if I don't have that deep voice, I'm not safe. I'm not safe in my workplace.
Yeah.
And some of that gets into our laws a little bit, and we're getting better in America about protections for LGBTQ people in the workplace. I even think it was just a few months ago, can't get fired for being gay in the workplace. You know, before we had some sexual orientation stuff where they can't discriminate against you being hired, but in several states you still could be fired for being gay. You know, and so that's, you know, just even in the workplace, like that's just a new thing for us. And so we've always kind of had a fear living in us, right, of you know, if I'm too gay or, you know, gay presenting or feminine presenting, I'm going to lose my job. And they can do that, especially at an Advil state.
So my question here, you know, you're talking about safety. There's a term psychological safety, and you're talking about just sort of legal protection. But the examples of voice editing and sort of gesturing, being in a butch way, if you will, can you just really draw the line even more sharply for us to understand? Like, what's the connection to trauma?
Do you want me to go, Sean?
Go for it, DDS.
Essentially, it's the whole thing around the diminishment of the self. And it's not okay to be me. And so I think many LGBTQ people that go into the workplace get so good at code switching and get so good at knowing when they go into this meeting, are they the hey girl, hey kind of gay who watches RuPaul on a Friday night? Or are they the asexual, bro it up, blank canvas so that they can be deemed acceptable? And we do that, right? We play into that to keep ourselves safe, even though we don't want to be that. Like, even in that moment, we don't want to necessarily express and paint our nails and, you know, and click the air, or we don't want to be the asexual bro it up kind of person to deem acceptable, but we have to, from a matter of safety, from a matter of getting by. And that just carves away, it shaves away inexorably at our very sense of self. And so remember earlier when we said that trauma doesn't have to be a one-off event? Like the life of code switching that can happen for many LGBTQ people in the workplace is just a long, slow, traumatic burn. And sometimes if we're lucky, we recognize that along the way, and we find workplaces and we get enough belief in ourselves to be able to show up as who we are, however we are. And sometimes we get until the end of our working lives and we pop out the other end into retirement and we go, who the fuck am I now?
So I'm going to try to translate a little bit just from my understanding, but also for the others watching this, and just help me make sure that I've got this. Like, what I hear you saying together, both of you, the lack of safety of being myself in a whatever's natural for me. If it's like with a lisp or a higher voice or with this kind of gesture, like the feeling of, oh, I can't be like that here. And the kind of code switching of like, oh, well, with my friends on the weekend, I can gay it up and whatever, but in the corporate boardroom or whatever, I have that back and forth, that checking the environment, is it safe, takes a toll on me in such a way that I can't cope with. I can't actually make sense of it in the way that I can't make sense of in a psychological sense. Like, if I did see an explosion of a car and people dying, like, it's just too much to make sense of. This drip, drip, drip of code switching has its own way of like, I just can't cope with it. There's just too much. And so when there's a graying out of the self, I had this image of like a scene just being kind of grayed out, DDS, when you were describing that. And like, I get blanched of my character, of my vitality, of my personality. And that is a diminishment as well. Like it might be if I am, you know, traumatized, and I think of like shock, seeing an explosion of people and their bodies everywhere. Like that's sort of robotic shock that I understand somehow as a layperson that that's a kind of trauma too. Do I have that kind of right?
For sure. I think what's coming up for me a little bit too is the need to kind of talk about a little bit about acute versus chronic trauma.
Beautiful.
Because what we're pointing at too, I think which is more maybe a narrative of the LGBTQIA community as a whole, is the experience of chronic trauma. And that's more, Dominic, I think of what you're saying is that drip, right? It's not this flood of stuff, bodies flying everywhere, right? Like that's more acute. That's probably not all people's life story, but probably once in your life something like that happening. But what we're experiencing here when we talk about tone policing and code switching is much more of that drip, that's slow. It's consistent over time. Yeah, so it's long living.
Useful distinction. Thank you for that. Let's now actually make this in a way even more practical. So when we are with our boyfriend, our partners, our gay friends, or just like LGBTQ, we're at a gay bar, and we're interacting with folks. Help us out here. How can we sense? How can we put our antennae up and sense that trauma is in the mix, in the interaction we're having with this person that we maybe have a real relationship with, and we know really well, yeah. Or in a group, if we can sense in a whole group of friends, for example, you can just kind of know in that moment, trauma is here. Can you give us some tips on that?
Don't be drinking. Don't be on cocaine, meth, or any drugs, or drinking, because that right there already diminishes your ability to be aware of that. So I just want to start with that caveat. I think for some of the things that I think I notice, eyes for me are always very telling for whether a person wants to be there or not. So if you see a lot of darting of eyes, that usually for me is a sign that this person's not comfortable in this moment. They're not comfortable in this environment, and I don't know what the trigger is, but it could be an ex walking in the room and they're like, I got to get out of here, right? That could be one example of that. People kind of always moving constantly towards the door is kind of always a really prime good sign that they need to get out of there. They need to get out of this space. So those are some examples that come to my mind immediately.
Yeah, I think that it's a really good place to start in just assuming that trauma is present, because I think it's just a good place to start. And if you start from there, then trauma-informed friendship, trauma-informed partnership is all about consent and just seeking permission every single step of the way. And so I think, in the times when you can be aware of it, just assume that there are going to be things that are triggering from a past trauma perspective, and seek consent and seek permission, and allow people to exit if they want to maintain their boundaries if they want to, and to do what they need to do to take care of themselves. So forcing people, making fun of people, singling people out, saying to people, just one more and then we'll go, and don't be silly, it's not like that, minimizing people's experience. Just don't do that shit, because it's harsh. Yeah.
Trauma-informed friendship. This is a new concept for me. I really love it.
I just made it up.
Yeah.
Coin it, patent that right now. DDS and Company, trauma-informed friendship.
I mean, in my world, we talk about trauma-informed coaching, and it's partly, to have exactly this kind of literacy and understanding from conversations like this one, that coaches can kind of come to our clients with some appreciation for what that might look like. Wow, trauma-informed friendship. And the next question that I had, and you already began to sort of answer, was well, how do we hold that? What do we do when we do sense? I mean, of course, in some moments, trauma is going to be more operative than in others, but when we do sense it, so the first thing I got from DDS, what you said was no compulsion, no forcing, appreciating that there could be much more going on in the depth of that person, the significance of this action or inaction could be much more difficult for them than we could ever imagine. And that's just, so holding a spaciousness is part of what you're urging us to in our friendships. And then consent was the other thing, sort of asking permission. Like, is it okay if I do this? Or is it okay if we go there? Or, and really having an attachment to the answer is another piece of what you're saying. Sean, what would you add?
Yeah, I'm enamored actually with this trauma-informed friendship. So thank you so much for that, DDS. That's such a powerful thing. And I'm right along with you as I think about this and expanding on a trauma-informed friendship. That the consent, I think, is you mentioned, is a super important piece. But just being aware, being a good steward in your friendship, asking those open-ended questions, don't assume your own agenda, and really leaning into what's going on for them. What comes to mind a little bit, right, is those invitations that you get from a friend of like, hey, I just need to talk, right? And that just being like what they need. They just need you to be present, and listen to, they're inviting you into their trauma narrative and into their trauma story. Being there and sitting with that can be much. And so I think, there's an awareness you need to have for yourself as a trauma-informed friend, of knowing that, like, if you have an inkling, I can't even say the word right now, but you know what word I'm going for here. I think about domestic violence, and it is pervasive even in our community. So if you know a friend is experiencing that, and for yourself that is a trigger for you, hearing that, being witness to that, experiencing that, I think it's also okay for you to be able to say, like, I can't hear your story, but I'm here for you, and I will sit with you. And just be, and that's an okay thing. Like, I want, like, the world to know it's okay to just sit with someone and not say anything.
Sean, what you're saying is bringing forward something for me around not fixing stuff for other people. A trauma-informed friend will hold space and will refrain from giving advice, right? Like the advice giving that we like to do, the rescuing that we like to do, is usually for ourselves. It's not usually for the other person, even though we like to think it's for the other person. It's usually done really to either calm ourselves down, or to make ourselves feel good, or to give ourselves a pat on the back for being the person that asked the greatest question that solved it for that individual. But the most beautiful thing that anybody can ever do for anyone in a trauma-informed way is to just hold that space, and as Sean said, I'm willing to sit here with you. I don't know the answer, I don't know your answer, but I'm here for you. That is deep trauma-informed friendship.
Yeah, thank you. Coming up for me that, I have, over the last year or so, become friends with each of you. And the three of us have had a number of these conversations. Yeah, and part of this, the benefit for this is this conversation is indeed our trauma-informed friendship. In like, yes, as professionals of a certain kind, but also as LGBTQ folks, so we have our own histories, we have our own traumas, we have our own journeys, and that's really a metaphor that I really appreciate around trauma, is the metaphor of a journey. Journey with it, journey from it. And I want to just open a little bit of space again, you know, with in a very trauma-informed way for each of you, without any compulsion, to share something if you like, and I will perhaps do the same of our own journeys with our own traumas, and the healing from it that we may have done, or the ways that that's helpful. And again, the purpose here is for our audience and others to in some ways normalize this, and in some ways perhaps have an idea of what it might look like to go further on their own journey of healing. I'm saying too much, but let me be quiet and just open that space.
Yeah. For sure, yeah. If you're okay, DDS, I'll go first, because I got an example that popped into my head. You know, in my own journey, my own one of my trauma stories. I think we all got a few, but you know, for me, and just the quick sort of synopsis of this, you know, is you know, being a child and growing up without one of my parents. I just grew up with my dad, and I didn't have my mom present. You know, and that was a piece that was definitely missing in my youth and my adolescence. And you know, for me, when I look back on growing up and who I was and who I developed into, you know, when my mom would show up, it would be such a triggering event for me in my youth. You know, I would become irritable and, you know, a bit aggressive, and, you know, not quite hostile, but, you know, a lot of anger, you know, and I'm still on this trauma journey today. You know, I was just talking with my partner just a couple of weeks ago, and he was like, "You don't talk about your mom much." And, you know, the second I started to talk about it, you know, just overwhelmed, I was, you know, tears coming down, right? You know, and it's just like, it's still present. I'm still working on this journey. As you can see, I'm already getting teary thinking about it. You know, but what I know now, and when I, you know, for myself, is that, like, when I talk with my mom, you know, and I have communication with her, I'm not hostile. I'm not, you know, angry and irritable, and it was always directed at other people, right? I would always be lashing out, you know, at my dad or my friends, and, you know, it wasn't something that they deserved, or it wasn't about them. You know, it was about, you know, the feelings that I had of neglect and abandonment growing up from my mother. So still a journey I'm on, you know, and I might always be on it. I don't know, but I know more now about that, and having done some work around that.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that part of your life experience with us.
Yeah, you, Sean.
And one of the things I notice in the way that you talk about the journey is that you have an awareness today about like that irritability. It's like, oh, how interesting. It was always directed to other people, and it didn't have anything to do with them. So that's, you didn't know that maybe at, I don't know, 14 or something, but, and now at your not so advanced age, but, you know, at your way that you're at.
I'm over so many years old. Yeah.
So that's part of the journey. You just have greater awareness of how it impacts you. It doesn't mean it doesn't still happen, but you sort of like see it and know it as a familiar visitor.
Yeah, I think there's a power in being able to name it and know it and recognize it. That at least for myself has truly helped me. And let me say, right, like, it didn't happen in my 20s. It's more that something that happened in the last few years of my life. So addressing trauma, it takes time, and it takes such bravery and courage to step into the trauma and recognize it and work your way through it towards healing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
May I, DDS, actually say something here?
Yeah, I mean, it's always an honor when someone. I find it honoring when someone in your presence is able to talk about and share their story and trauma. I'm so humbled by that, Sean. So thank you. I think, when I think about my journey, I'm 48, and and in fact, this evening in 2 hours, I have my weekly therapy, and I'm in weekly therapy. And as a therapist, I'm in weekly therapy, and the theme that continues to be discussed, and I have a bit like Sean, I have a beautiful awareness of it, and yet I'm still often gripped by this trauma response. And so growing up as a child, there really wasn't that much love. In fact, quite the opposite in my house. And it was a tough environment to grow up in. And we're recording, so I don't want this particularly recorded and broadcast out. So it was a tough childhood. And the only times that I can ever recall receiving any degree of positive acknowledgement is when I did well, when I did well in spelling, or when I made the bed or performed some sort of task. So I learned very early on that love was conditional. I learned that in order to be okay, I needed to perform. And so when I think about my professional career, in part, I think I owe my success to my trauma response, which is work hard and be loved, right? Work hard and be valued. But at the same time, it's come with some consequences. It's come with consequences whereby I forsake myself, I forsake my partner, I forsake, and sometimes in very damaging ways, whereby I will work and work and work and work in order to seek approval or to be approved of. I'll work and work and work in order to receive acknowledgement, not because I'm praise hungry, but because acknowledgement affirms me, affirms that I'm whole, and it affirms that I'm complete. And when that affirmation doesn't come, I am crushed. And sometimes even when that affirmation does come, I'm so worn out from wearing myself into the ground. And still today, as a 48-year-old, from that experience back then, I'm still unpicking it. I'm still working on it, and I'm still finding sometimes that I am in the grip of it. Yeah.
Thank you for telling us about that aspect of your journey.
Now I have a vulnerability hangover. Like, oh shit, did I share too much?
Not at all. Not at all. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
So many people who are watching this have never been to a therapist. I'm making up, and maybe because of what they're learning from you and from this conversation, someone might decide, I'm ready to start a new phase of this journey of really being with my trauma in a different way, more aware way, more conscious way. I'm not really sure what language to use here, but to heal is one language, one word I want to use. And if they did start to see a therapist, can you just give a little taste? Like, what would they expect? Like DDS, you're just saying, okay, I'm somehow working on this trauma in my weekly session. In a general sense, from both of you, and this is a professional question as well as a personal one, like, what might it look like to deal with my trauma in a therapy session?
Bring some tissues. Honestly, tears always happen. I think, like, just vulnerability. You're really stepping into what's a bit of a sacred space for you, right? Whether you've talked about your trauma ever or not, it's sacred. It's personal to you, and there's a lot of hurt. There's a lot of pain. There's shame. There's guilt, sadness, anger. Like there's the plethora of emotions, the journey of emotions that you will go on when you start to touch on your trauma, its impact on your life today, and what it could be if you don't address with it, what the impact of your future could be if you don't address your trauma. DDS just gave a beautiful example of for his own journey and how, right, like same for me, of just like how trauma has manifested in our relationships and how us not addressing it could make it worse. It could be worse. So
let me play the part of someone who might be skeptical, and for the sake of giving maybe even a stronger case. And in fact, I have a dear friend. I had a conversation akin to this recently, and he said, I said, hey, have you thought about seeing a therapist? We weren't necessarily talking about trauma. And he said, oh, yeah, I did that once. I feel like it's just wallowing in my sadness and pain. And like, just wallowing in that, I don't see, I don't need to be there. I want to get past it, not go back and rehash and wallow. Can you just give a encouraging response or some kind of, I don't know. What's your response?
I mean, that in itself might be a trauma response, right? Like we don't talk about our shit, right? Move on, bury it under the carpet, and there are some people that grow up in families that say, don't talk about your feelings. And for some people, being in that pain is too painful. So it's just like, I'm going to exit. I mean, as a trauma-informed therapist, if someone comes into therapy with me with trauma, the first thing I do is not talk about the trauma. The first thing I do is build a space of safety so that the individual that is in therapy, when they're ready to go there and talk about these painful experiences, they feel safe and have a deep level of rapport and trust to be able to do it. And it also depends on what kind of therapist you choose, because there are so many flavors of therapists out there. And you can have a relational therapist, you can have a psychodynamic therapist, you can have a very specific trauma-informed therapists who will all have different approaches. So I would say to your friend, if they haven't had a great experience once, doesn't mean to say they're not going to have a great experience again. And I think finding a therapist is just the same as though you would be shopping for a bed, right? Like you don't go and spend $5,000 on the first bed you lie on in the mattress store, right? So it's like, speak to a bunch of therapists and ask them what their approach is. Tell them what your experiences have been. Tell them what your fears are about coming into therapy. Tell them about what your hopes are. And if they're playing their game well, your therapist will say, I don't think I'm for you. Or you'll be able to say, I don't think you're the therapist for me. But shop around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And in addition to therapy, or besides it, before it, after it, what are some other resources or that you would point someone to if they want to go further with their journey, with their trauma, or steps that someone might take aside from therapy? Any ideas there?
So I'm going to be a huge advocate here. The book, The Body Keeps the Score, there's a workbook to that as well. And that's something you can do very easily by yourself. Several chapters, worksheets, so I strongly believe that you need to complement it with a therapist or a coach You know, what might be nice about a therapist, right, is if there's definitely something other than just the trauma. Like there's some depression, some anxiety. There's something that truly needs somebody who's got that grounding, that expertise. You know, with a coach, what might be beautiful, and for your friend, especially Dominic, that you were talking about, who was like, well, I just want to do the thing and just move forward, right? And working with a coach, what might be really beautiful, and a coach who has some trauma background,
like yourself,
like myself, for example, is, you know, working with the saboteurs, right? I think there's a great parallel and connection to how our saboteurs show up, and they are signs and symptoms of they're protectors of the trauma that you have experienced, that shows up, manifests itself today, and could be showing up, preventing you from getting that job, from you doing your next career, from writing that book that you dreamt of writing forever, right? And so for your friend, like, I would be like, yeah, work with a coach, because you want to drive forward. You have a vision for your future. And, you know, so you can do that work around the saboteurs and drive forward. But definitely, I would say much more so with a therapist, if there's definitely another component that's showing up, anxiety, depression, mania, something else. I think
abuse.
Yeah, substance abuse. You know, there's something there that a therapist can offer that a coach might not be trained in to be able to provide you.
Right. Yeah. Plus one, fully endorse everything that Sean has just said, and the other person that I'd give a shout out to is a person called Pat Ogden. 2 seconds, because this book, Sensory Motive Psychotherapy, is all about kind of working with the body in trauma. And in this book, I mean, it's written from 2 perspectives. It's written for like a therapist, but it's also written for the client. And there are, a bit like the Body Keeps the Score workbook, there are worksheets in here that help you kind of connect with your body and understand what the body is saying. So both those 2 resources and everything that Sean just said, I'm here for that.
Since we're doing book plugs, and I don't have my copy of The Body Keeps the Score right on my, but I want to make a plug for this book, and this is partly where I get part of journey or travel. So Gretchen Smeltzer has recently come out with it, and she uses the metaphor of like climbing a mountain, and the training for mountain climbing, and the cyclical nature of kind of bringing coherence to our trauma. And in fact, Sean, early in this last piece of talking about our own experiences, you use the term trauma story. And actually it connects back to DDS, your bit about making sense as a really crucial part of it. And not being able to make sense is part of what trauma is. So as we do storytelling, as we bring a coherent narrative to our trauma, we are making sense of it, and that's part of the integration. Now I'm talking as if I'm an expert, but I have been learning about this for some time. So one more resource to point folks to. Thank you both for delving into this important topic and for opening up about your own experience. Just before we close, are there any other last things that you'd like to say to each other or to our viewers to close this time?
Well, I just want to say I have such love and respect for both you, Dominic, and you, DDS. It has been great to connect and to just, you know, deepen our connection, deepen my love for both of you. So thank you for inviting me into this journey, allowing me to be a part of it. Over a year ago, Dominic, I think you and I connected. And shortly thereafter, DDS, you walked in. So just want to thank you both from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I would express that too, and the feeling is mutual. And you know, I think my grad school professor trauma class said something to me that has stuck with me, which is that trauma robs you of your aliveness. And I think if that's not the case for exploring it and finding way through it, then that, you know, what is the case? And so if there's any aspect of you where you're not feeling alive, that might be worth exploring.
Beautiful. Truly words of wisdom from both of you, and wisdom wrapped in love. And yeah, if I might say, our own, and this goes for me too, our own wounds are very much present in this conversation, in our the valence that we give to this topic. It is because of our woundedness that we're able to go there, and because we have such an eagerness. I mean, the eagerness we have to serve others around this comes from our own hurts, and our own healing from those hurts. And this certainly has been a healing, a learning experience for me in this hour. I too am very grateful to you both. Thank you.
Pleasure.